Claude responded. Most men worry about losing their savings to a bad investment. Most men worry about losing their savings to a bad investment. I lost mine to my own wife, and I found out because a locksmith called me from my garage. My name is Walter Coleman. I'm 64 years old. I live in a 4-bedroom house outside Tulsa, Oklahoma, the same house I've owned for 22 years. I coached Little League for a decade. I retired from the Postal Service 6 years ago, and until 9 days ago, folks, I thought I was the luckiest old man in this county. Before I tell you what happened, do me a favor. If you're new here, hit subscribe. Costs you nothing, means a lot to me. Give this a like, and tell me down in the comments what you would have done in my shoes, because I promise you, by the end of this, you'll have an opinion. Now, let me tell you about my wife. Her name is Doreen Coleman. Married 19 years, together for 22. She does the crossword every morning in pen, never pencil, because she says she's never wrong. She waters her orchids with ice cubes because some magazine told her to. She takes her tea black, no sugar, no cream, and I always found that a little cold for a woman I thought was so warm. I knew this woman. I knew her, or I thought I did. It started on a Monday in October, the kind of gray Oklahoma morning where the sky can't decide if it wants to rain. Doreen was in Baton Rouge visiting her sister Fran. She'd been gone 4 days. I was doing what any man my age does when his wife's away eating leftover chili straight from the pot, falling asleep in front of the ball game, not shaving. Living large. Friends. Then the garage door started acting up. Wouldn't close all the way. Grinding on something. I called the first garage door outfit. In the phone book, a fella named Marcus Webb from Webb's overhead door service showed up within the hour. Young guy, good manners, the kind of handshake you don't forget. "Give me 20 minutes, sir," he said, heading into the garage. I gave him 30, poured myself coffee, watched the second inning. Then my phone buzzed. A text from Marcus, standing not 15 feet from my kitchen window. "Sir, there's a false wall behind your workbench. It's not original construction. Do you know what's behind it?" I laughed, out loud, alone in my own kitchen. Typed back, "Marcus, that's just pegboard and drywall, buddy. Nothing back there but dust." 3 dots appeared. Then, "Sir, there's a keypad lock on it, and it's got a fresh battery. This was installed recently." I set my coffee down so hard it sloshed onto the counter. A keypad. Not a padlock a man forgets about. A keypad, with a fresh battery, in a wall that had no business existing. I want you to sit with that detail the way I had to. A hidden door is one thing. A hidden door with a keypad that somebody's been keeping charged means somebody's been visiting it. Regularly. Recently. I was out that back door, and into the garage before I even remembered standing up. Marcus was standing in front of my workbench, the one I built with my own 2 hands the summer we moved in, and it had been pulled 6 inches off the wall. Behind it, drywall that didn't match the rest of the garage, painted a shade of white just slightly wrong if you knew what you were looking at, and I did. Because I'd painted that garage twice in 22 years. Set into that wall, a steel door with a digital keypad, green light blinking, steady, patient, like it was waiting on somebody. "Call the police," I told Marcus. "Way ahead of you, sir," he said, phone already at his ear. 3 officers arrived in 11 minutes. I stood in my own garage, feeling like a stranger had moved into my life while I wasn't looking, and they worked a battering ram on that door for what felt like an hour but was probably 4 minutes. The door gave. The room behind it was small, maybe 8 feet by 6, and it was empty. Not just empty staged. A single folding chair, a space heater, still humming warm, and on the folding chair, a manila envelope with my name typed on the front. Walter, Officer Nguyen, a young woman who couldn't have been older than my granddaughter, opened it with gloved hands. Inside was a stack of photographs. Photographs of a woman I had never seen in my life. Blonde, maybe 45, laughing at a barbecue, sitting on a porch swing, standing in front of what looked like a lake house. Underneath the photographs, a single sheet of paper with a name typed at the top, Carol Ann Whitfield. And beneath her name, a date. A date 8 days prior. "Ma'am," Officer Nguyen said into her radio, "we're going to need to run a name." I stood there in my garage, 64 years old, staring at a stranger's smiling face, and I felt the floor tilt under me even though I hadn't moved an inch. They found out that afternoon, right there in my driveway, radio crackling. Carol Ann Whitfield had been reported missing 8 days earlier, out of Shreveport, Louisiana, missing. And her photographs were sitting in an envelope with my name on it, inside a hidden room behind my own garage wall, with a keypad lock that somebody had been keeping charged. I don't know exactly when I stopped being the confused homeowner and started being a suspect, but it happened the way spoiled milk happens. You don't notice the moment, you just notice the smell. 1 minute, Officer Nguyen is asking me routine questions about the garage. The next, a detective named Ruth Alvarez is sitting across from me at my own kitchen table, legal pad out, asking whether I had ever rented storage space under a business called Coleman Rentals, LLC. I told her I had never heard those words in my life. She turned her legal pad around and showed me the incorporation paperwork. My signature, my social security number, filed 9 months ago. Mr. Coleman, Detective Alvarez said, watching my face the way a poker player watches hands, not eyes. We pulled records on that LLC. It leases a storage unit in Shreveport. When our Louisiana counterparts opened it this morning, they found women's clothing, a prepaid phone, and $4,200 in cash in an envelope. Do you know Carol Ann Whitfield? No, I said. I have never laid eyes on that woman. And that was true. Completely, entirely true. But here is the thing that cracked something loose in my chest that I did not tell Detective Alvarez that night, because I needed to sit alone with it first. When I finally got a minute to myself, I walked up to our bedroom, straight to the cedar chest at the foot of our bed, the one Doreen keeps her mother's old quilts in, the one she opens every autumn like a ritual and closes just as quick. I lifted the quilts out one at a time, and there, folded inside the second one, was a photograph. Carol Ann Whitfield, smiling, tucked into the fabric like a pressed flower. I sat down on the edge of the bed I had shared with my wife for 19 years, in a house that suddenly didn't feel like mine, holding proof that the woman who slept beside me every night had been keeping a stranger's face folded into her mother's quilts. And I thought back over 22 years, every anniversary dinner, every Christmas morning, every ordinary Tuesday where she'd sat across from me doing that crossword in pen, never once looking up like a woman with a secret. How long had Carol Ann Whitfield's photograph been sitting in that cedar chest? How long had Doreen been planning whatever this was? At 64, I always figured the worst thing that could happen to a man my age was a bad hip or a bad diagnosis. Turns out the worst thing is finding out the woman who held your hand at your mother's funeral was never fully in the room with you at all. If you've stuck with me this far, and you want more stories like this one, it helps more than you know if you hit that like button and subscribe. Thank you, truly. Here's something nobody warns you about when your own wife sets you up. The hardest part isn't the evidence stacked against you. It's realizing the woman wasn't ever confused, or going through something, or having a hard year. She was working. The whole time, she was working. I need you to understand where my head was at. It had been 5 days since Marcus Webb texted me from my own garage. 5 days since 3 officers stood in a hidden room behind my workbench, looking at me like a man who needed watching. 5 days since Detective Ruth Alvarez started appearing, sometimes with questions, sometimes just parked across the street in an unmarked sedan like I wouldn't notice. I noticed her every time. I'm 64, not senile. Doreen flew back from Baton Rouge the day after the garage incident. When she walked through that door, she looked exactly the way a frightened wife should look. Eyes wide, both hands on my face, voice shaking. Walter, what in God's name happened here? And Lord help me, for the better part of an hour, I believed every word. She cried when I showed her the hole in the garage wall. Real tears, or tears that looked real enough that I still can't tell the difference. She held onto my arm while I walked her through the keypad, the folding chair, the space heater. She said all the things a scared wife says. This is terrifying, Walter. Who would do this to us? Do we need a lawyer? That question. Do we need a lawyer? I thought it was fear talking. I understand now I was strategy talking. The Shreveport storage unit is what cracked her mask, but only for a heartbeat. When Detective Alvarez came back 3 days later and told us both about Coleman Rentals LLC, I was watching Doreen's face the whole time. Most people would have missed it. It lasted less than a second. A flicker, like a light bulb dimming before it catches again. Then the tears came right back on schedule. "Somebody is framing my husband," she said, gripping my hand across the table like her life depended on it. "This is obviously a setup. Walter has never set foot in Louisiana in his life." Detective Alvarez looked at her, then at me, then back at her. "Mrs. Coleman," she said carefully, "how do you know it's obvious?" Doreen didn't even blink. "Because I know my husband." I turned that sentence over in my head at least 300 times in the 2 days that followed. She didn't say he would never do this. She didn't say that's impossible. She said she knew me, which kept the whole conversation about certainty instead of character. That's not a wife's answer. That's a lawyer's answer, wearing a wife's perfume. Here's where things get complicated, so stay with me. I have an old army buddy named Harold Speck. Served together, and a man who served with you learns to tell you the truth, even when it costs him a friendship. Harold spent 30 years in bank fraud investigation before he retired, which means he spent his whole professional life learning how liars build things that look like the truth from the outside. I called him on day 6 and told him everything, start to finish. He didn't say a word for a long time. "Walter," he finally said, "how many joint accounts do you and Doreen have?" 4. "Who handles them?" I opened my mouth to answer, and realized I didn't fully know. Doreen managed the money. Had since about a year into our marriage, back when I mentioned I found bill paying tedious, and she'd offered to take it off my plate. I never thought about it again. Why would I? The mortgage got paid. The savings grew, slow and steady. Everything looked fine from where I was sitting. "Pull every statement you've got," Harold said. "Go back at least 6 years." I pulled 8. What I found didn't jump off the page and scream at me. That was the cleverness of it. No dramatic wire transfers. No suspicious lump sums that would set off alarms in a bank's back office. Instead, there were small, patient, almost boring movements. $60 here, routed to an account with a name I didn't recognize. A recurring charge to a shell company I'd never heard of. A cash withdrawal, regular as clockwork, every second month, never enough to trip a federal reporting requirement. Over 8 years, it totaled just past $71,000. $71,000, moved so quietly I never heard so much as a whisper. I sat at my kitchen table at 2 in the morning with those numbers in front of me and felt a particular kind of cold settle into my bones. Not the cold of being scared, the cold of understanding scale. Because this wasn't a woman who'd made one bad decision after a hard season in her life. The first irregular transfer was dated 16 months after our wedding. She'd started building this while we were still hanging our first set of curtains together. Harold drove up from his place in Muskogee the next morning. We spread everything across my dining room table, bank statements, the LLC paperwork, the police report, a timeline I'd scratched out on a legal pad at 3 in the morning. Harold studied it in silence for a long stretch, which is his way of showing you respect for something that's worse than you think. "The storage unit lease," he said eventually. "Walk me through your phone that week." "What do you mean?" "Where was your phone the night before that LLC got filed?" I thought about it. "On the charger. On my nightstand. I always charge it overnight on my nightstand. Same spot for 22 years. Harold looked at me steady. "And where was Doreen?" "In our bed. Right next to me." We'd shared that bed for 19 years, and I had never once considered a charging phone 6 inches from my head as a weak spot in my whole life. She had taken it while I slept. Filed the LLC paperwork under my name using my phone's authentication, my signature scanned and reused from some old document, and had it back on that nightstand before my alarm ever went off. I tried to remember the morning after. Had she seemed tired, off, distracted? I couldn't recall a single thing, because Mondays I leave the house at 6 for my volunteer shift at the VA hospital, and I kiss her cheek and grab my thermos and never once look back on my way out the door. 22 years of never looking back. "The garage door?" Harold said quietly. I looked at him. "You told me the door started malfunctioning that morning out of nowhere. Did you call Webb's from your cell or the house line?" "We haven't had a house line since 2015. Cell." I said. Pull your call log for that morning. I already knew, somewhere down in my gut, what I'd find before I found it. The call to Webb's overhead door service had gone out from my number at 7:52 that morning. I had been at my VA shift by 7. I had a sign-in sheet with a supervisor's initials to prove it. Doreen had made that call. From my phone, taken again, or maybe never fully given back, and used to book a repairman she knew would end up standing at that workbench, find the fresh paint, find the keypad, and text me in a panic. She had engineered the entire opening act. I still don't fully understand how she jammed that garage door mechanism to force a repair call in the first place, but Harold figures it was something simple, a shim or a sensor tampered with, something a person could remove just as easily as they installed it. The hidden room, built or found and prepared over God knows how long. The envelope with my name on it, time down to the day. She'd been in Baton Rouge at her sister's, and with one phone call from a burner, set the whole machine turning while I sat at home eating chili and watching a ball game. Walter, Harold said, and his voice dropped into that register men use right before they say something they wish they didn't have to. This isn't a plan a person throws together over a rough couple of months. The money alone goes back 8 years. Getting your signature right, your accounts, your name on paperwork you never saw, that takes practice. That takes repetition. He paused. She didn't just study you, Walter. She became fluent in you. I stood up and walked to my kitchen window and looked out over the backyard. The same yard I'd mowed 1,000 times. The same rose bed Doreen had planted the spring after we married, that I'd watered faithfully every summer evening because she told me roses needed consistency. I had been out there faithfully watering her roses while she built my grave underneath them. At 64 years old, I had exactly one move left, and I hadn't told Harold about it yet. I hadn't told anybody, because the only way this worked was if Doreen believed, fully and comfortably, that her plan had already succeeded. She needed to think she'd won, and I needed her to stay comfortable just long enough for me to finish what I was about to start. There is a particular kind of stillness that comes over an old man when he stops being afraid and starts being dangerous. I found that stillness on a Thursday morning, sitting at my kitchen table with cold coffee and 8 years of bank records spread in front of me, and I made a decision I have not lost a wink of sleep over since. I did not call a lawyer. I did not confront Doreen across that same kitchen table. I did not walk back into Detective Alvarez's office with what Harold and I had put together, because here's the plain truth about evidence. It only carries weight if the man handing it over still has any credibility left. And right then, in the eyes of the Tulsa PD, I was a 64-year-old man whose name was on an LLC connected to a missing woman's belongings. My word wasn't worth much at that particular moment. Doreen had accounted for that too. Of course she had. So I did the one thing she hadn't planned on. I became a man she couldn't read anymore. First, I called my son, Neil. Neil Coleman, 38 years old, works corporate security out of Dallas, the kind of man who reads a room before he says a word in it, and has never once raised his voice at anybody in his life. I drove down to Dallas on a Friday, told Doreen I needed a few days to clear my head, and watched her face rearrange itself into the perfect look of gentle understanding. "Take all the time you need, honey," she said. I nearly smiled right there in the doorway. At Neil's kitchen table over black coffee, I laid it all out: the garage, the storage unit down in Shreveport, the bank records, the phone logs, the photograph folded into his mother's quilts. Neil listened without a single interruption, which for a man in his line of work means he's already 3 steps ahead of where you're talking. When I finished, he sat quiet for a long moment. "You said she talks to somebody," he said. "Somebody she trusts completely." "Her friend Sherry," I said. "Sherry Voss. They've been close since before your mother and I ever met. Talk on the phone most every week. In person or by phone?" "Both. Sherry lives over in Little Rock, visits 3 or 4 times a year, and they take these long calls out on the back porch, door shut, sometimes 2 hours at a stretch." Neil nodded slow. "How long ago did you put a recorder out on that back porch, Dad?" I looked at him. "I haven't. I know you haven't," he said, "but you're about to. I want to be clear about something. I am not, by nature, a vengeful man. I coached Little League for 10 years, and never once raised my voice at an umpire. I'm the fellow at the family reunion making sure everybody's got a plate before he sits down to eat his own. Revenge was never part of my makeup. But I have always been a patient man, and it turns out patience is the only currency that matters when you're playing a long game against somebody who's been playing one for 8 years already. Neil ordered a small voice-activated recorder online, paid with cash at a drugstore kiosk, had it shipped to a P.O. box under a name that wasn't mine. 38 years old, and that boy has more operational sense than half the men I served with. I drove home Sunday, told Doreen I was feeling more like myself, let her hold on to me in the front hallway while I counted her heartbeat against my chest, and felt absolutely nothing. That was the strangest part of the whole ordeal. Not rage, not grief, just a flat, clean clarity, like looking through a window that's finally been washed. I installed the recorder on a Monday afternoon while Doreen was at her book club. Small thing, battery-powered, tucked up under the eave of the back porch behind a hanging fern that neither one of us had moved in 19 years. Took me all of 5 minutes. I drove out to Neil's that evening, confirmed the audio came through clean on his laptop, and drove home for supper. Doreen had made pot roast, asked if I was finally feeling like my old self again. Getting there, I told her. She smiled and topped off my sweet tea. I waited 17 days. 17 days of being Walter Coleman, devoted husband, agreeable resident, casual suspect in a missing persons case. 17 days of answering Detective Alvarez's questions patiently, of letting Doreen squeeze my hand in front of her, of watching my wife perform worry so convincingly that even I had moments, brief and disorienting, where I wondered if grief had made me imagine the whole thing. Then on a Wednesday evening in the third week, Sherry Voss came up from Little Rock for a visit. I made myself scarce, told Doreen I was heading over to Harold's for the evening, kissed her on the cheek, and drove exactly 6 blocks before I pulled over and opened my phone. The audio came through clear as a church bell. They talked 20 minutes about nothing much, Sherry's grandkids, a church bazaar, a new restaurant off the highway worth the drive. I nearly convinced myself I'd wasted good money on a recorder based on nothing but an old man's grief and Harold's suspicious mind. Then Doreen's voice shifted. Subtle, like a singer sliding down a key. Same voice, same warmth in the tone, but underneath it something colder, more precise. He hasn't got a clue, Doreen said. Sherry was quiet a beat. You're sure? He's out there mowing the lawn like nothing's wrong. That detective's been circling him for 2 weeks. Walter is exactly who he's always been, Doreen said. Sweet and simple, and about 3 steps behind everything. He can't see past what's directly in front of him. Never could. And the woman, Carol Ann? Comfortable, Doreen said. She agreed to stay gone 60 days. She's up in Branson. I'm paying her well enough she won't open her mouth. By the time those 60 days run out, Walter will be too buried in paperwork to matter to anybody. A pause. Doreen, what happens to him actually happens. He becomes the answer to a question the sheriff's department is already asking out loud, Doreen said, calm as anything. They've got his name, his signature, his money trail. All I have to do is let it keep building on its own. Another month, maybe less, and it won't need me touching it anymore. It'll have its own weight. And where will you be? Somewhere with better weather, Doreen said. And then she laughed, easy and satisfied, the laugh of a woman watching a plan land exactly where she'd aimed it. I sat in my truck 6 blocks from my own house, listening to my wife of 19 years laugh about the architecture of my ruin, and that stillness settled over me again, cold and complete. I didn't call Neil. I didn't call Harold. I didn't call Detective Alvarez. Not yet. I want to tell you about Carol Ann Whitfield, because she matters in all this too. 2 days after Sherry's visit, I hired a retired Tulsa PD detective named Rudy Marsh, a man Harold vouched for, the kind of fellow whose whole personality is an evidence locker. I gave Rudy one job: find Carol Ann Whitfield. It took him 5 days. She was up in Branson, just like Doreen had said, staying at a roadside motel off the strip, paying cash, checked in under a name close to her own, but not quite. Rudy got photographs, got her cooperation. Got a signed, notarized statement from a woman who, it turned out, hadn't fully understood the legal weight of what she'd agreed to. and was noticeably less comfortable with the whole arrangement. Once a retired detective sat across from her in a motel lobby and explained the word accessory out loud. Carol Ann Whitfield wasn't a criminal at heart. She was a woman down on her luck who made one terrible decision for money. She told Rudy everything: how Doreen found her, what she'd been paid, how she'd been coached to stay hidden for 60 days exactly. She signed that statement with a shaking hand and cried for the better part of 10 minutes, and Rudy sat with her until she was done, because underneath that evidence locker exterior, the man has a decent heart. I now had a recorded conversation off my own back porch, and a signed statement from a missing woman who had never actually been missing. Two things Doreen had no idea existed. Here is what I chose not to do. I did not march into the Tulsa Police Department and hand over what I had, because evidence handed over by a suspect, no matter how clean, becomes part of a slow legal grind, and during that grind, Doreen would lawyer up, go quiet, and spend the next year and a half unraveling everything I'd built from the other direction. She was good at unraveling things. I understood that fully now. So I did something a good deal simpler. On a Friday evening, while Doreen sat out on that same back porch with her tea, I sat at my kitchen table and sent 2 files from an email account she'd never seen to a phone number she wouldn't recognize. An audio clip and a photograph of Carol Ann Whitfield, alive and well in Branson, holding up that morning's newspaper. No message attached, no signature. I shut my laptop, rinsed my coffee cup, and went on up to bed. She came upstairs about 40 minutes later. I watched through half-closed eyes as she stood in our bedroom doorway for a long moment, phone in her hand, dead still. 19 years married to that woman, and I had never once seen Doreen Coleman stand completely still. She was always moving, always managing something, adjusting some detail. She stood in that doorway like a woman who'd heard a sound she couldn't place and couldn't shake. Good. The next morning, I drove to Detective Alvarez's office and set Rudy Marsh's full report down on her desk: the statement, the photographs, the financial records, the call logs, every last page of it organized in a green folder with a metal clasp, because I have always been a thorough man. Detective Alvarez read through it for close to 15 minutes, without once looking up. "Mr. Coleman," she finally said. "Ruth," I said, "I believe we both know I never filed that LLC paperwork." She looked at me a long moment, then reached for her phone. Doreen was arrested on a Tuesday morning, 16 charges including conspiracy, fraud, and obstruction of justice. She walked out of our house in handcuffs at 8:30, on a morning cold enough to fog up your breath. I watched from the front porch. She looked back at me one time, just the once, as they walked her toward the patrol car. And for the first time in 19 years, I could not read a single thing on that woman's face. Couldn't find the calculation behind her eyes. Couldn't locate the woman who had studied me the way a forger studies a signature. She just looked at me, and I nodded. Because here's what Doreen never once understood about her own husband, the one miscalculation sitting right at the center of her whole careful plan. She'd spent years watching what I did, where I went, how I signed my name, how I slept at night. She never once bothered paying attention to what I was thinking. At 64 years old, I am not a dramatic man. I don't make speeches at a woman being led off my own front porch in handcuffs. I don't slam doors. I don't need the last word. I only ever needed the last move. She spent 19 years building a cage for me. I built her one in 17 days. Somewhere tonight, Doreen Coleman is sitting in a cell, looking over her shoulder for a ghost she built with her own 2 hands, a husband she flat out underestimated, a man she was certain she knew from the inside out. She knew my signature down to the last curve of it. She never once knew my spine. And that, friends, was always going to be her one and only mistake. If this story got to you, do an old man a favor and hit that like button, subscribe if you haven't already, and let me know in the comments what you'd have done in my place. Thank you for sitting with me through this one. I'll see you next time. Claude responded, "Sometimes the people closest to us wear their true face so quietly we never think to look twice, and that's not a reason to stop trusting. It's a reason to stat. Sometimes the people closest to us wear their true face so quietly we never think to look twice, and that's not a reason to stop trusting. It's a reason to stay awake in love, to notice the small things, and to keep faith with your own quiet judgment. Real strength isn't loud. It's patient, steady, and it shows up exactly when you need it most, even at 64. A small note for you. This story was written and imagined by AI purely for entertainment, but we hope its simple life lessons still landed somewhere warm in your heart.